Bill Floyd.
Now try.
Where are you, John?
Hello?
Hello, hello. Where are you?
Yeah, you hear us, John?
Where am? Yeah, I can hear you. I am.
You don't want to know where he is.
Sister's beach house down in the Outer Banks with Hillary and Coco and Scotty.
I tried to tell you.
Oh.
Not for work. No work.
So jealous.
I tried to tell you, you didn't want to know.
Right.
Oh, look, I have handouts.
Oh, and my parents.
Oh, see, now, John, you gotta send me their emails.
Yeah, I
How-
forwarded. I got confused and they were coming back yesterday and I got, dude, I don't even know what day it is. So
Yeah, I just want to make sure that I include them because I sent this stuff out yesterday, but I didn't have their stuff.
no, I forwarded it to them.
Make sure Pastor John presses the YouTube go live button.
Boom, nailed it, nailed it. Gotta start traveling with my phone.
I didn't even recognize you, Josh.
I know. Summer hair, don't care. Yeah, you know what? It's too hot. And I bless all of you who have long hair and have to live with it. And I'm sorry that I have the privilege of being able to walk around with a shaved head.
It says we can't.
There's not saying you can't.
Just choose not to.
I'm just saying, you know,
Josh, well, we feel for you that you have to wear long pants, long jeans in July.
oh, is that right? You feel for me?
Yeah.
I mean-
Because blue jeans aren't exactly the coolest thing to wear in the summer.
There's Sue, have you been an elder at this church?
Yeah.
There's 4 elders in this place. Y'all can make the recommendation. There's one activist. Y'all can tell me to go in shorts on Sunday.
I think Pastor John might have a heart attack if you did that.
Why would John have the heart attack? I'm the one in jeans.
No, why if he says you have to rule on that? You show up in shorts.
I have never worn shorts in worship. However, I did wear that Hawaiian shirt for Gary's funeral, and it was the first time I had ever gone that casual for worship ever. And it felt so good.
It's great. It looked.
Now, I had the Birkenstocks, and I was thinking about wearing Birkenstocks while we're in the fellowship hall, and that might air condition a little bit.
We're cool, yeah.
But
you have all those cool shoes? I mean.
I have cool shoes. This is correct.
I think that they should pass the thing, not that you can wear jeans, but that you should wear a Hawaiian shirt every week. during the summer.
Oh, well, there's no dress code, but you know, it's more like, you know, I just don't want to get run out of town. All right.
I liked the Hawaiian shirt. I think it was totally appropriate for Gary's thing. Totally, completely.
It's appropriate for the summer too, in the fellowship hall.
Yeah.
I don't know that I could do it in the sanctuary for Sunday morning worship.
Well, I can bring it up.
There are some things I love for us to discuss. How a pastor dresses on Sunday is not one of those things.
An hour-long discussion on that.
I'll just do it. I didn't talk to anybody about my shoes. I'm just gonna wear what I wear and see, you know, see how people respond.
Hey, Julie.
So,
Hi, guys.
Josh, was today the first day of worshiping in Fellowship Hall?
You weren't in worship?
No.
Oh, wow.
So that was a yes or a no? After
Yeah.
the game?
Let's see. Now, is it Hal Seaman as well?
Yep. Yeah, my mom and dad both signed on.
And, okay, and Joe. All right. Well, let us begin. Good to see you all. I got you. Let us begin in prayer. I will open us in prayer. I know that y'all have done that corporately, and but we'll do the corporate closing prayer. But let us pray. God, forgive us for fighting for unity, yet scorning one another over facile doctrines, while your children are being murdered in the streets. Grant that those caught in the allure of debating the minute details of your love might return to true worship and the family of grace. Help those bound under the structures of authority to be freed to do your work in the world to the glory of Jesus, the head of the church. Amen.
Amen.
Let us go through our commitments of presence, and we'll start. Carla, if you will go toward Diana, Joan, over, and we'll go around.
Being fully present, set aside the usual distractions of things undone from yesterday, things to do tomorrow, and things impinging on the present for next moment.
Listen graciously. Listen intently to what is said. Listen to the feelings beneath the words. Listen to each other as you would listen to scripture, attentively, mindfully, and open to the Holy Spirit.
We come as equals. No person's gifts, limits, or experiences are more or less important than others.
It is never share or die. You will be invited to share stories, but you will determine the extent to which you want to participate.
No fixing. We are not here to change someone else's mind or fix them.
Suspend judgment. By creating a space between judgments and reactions, we can listen to another person and to ourselves more fully.
Turn to wonder. If you find yourself becoming judgmental or cynical, try turning to wonder. I wonder what my reaction teaches me. I wonder what they are feeling right now.
Practice confidentiality care. What is said here stays here, but what is learned here goes out. John, would you do the next one?
Yes, let me arrange my screen. Welcome discomfort and dislocation. Move against an instinct to construct a mental space of safety or to check out.
And Kitty, will you do J?
Love the questions themselves. Let your questions linger. Release the compulsion to answer them or to have them answered.
And may they be so. I hope these have been good guideposts for you in our last two classes. As I had mentioned before, these have been important for me for the better part of the last 6 to 7 years. I go through them almost weekly, if not several times a month, and they're important guideposts for me as I gauge in relationship with others, but especially as we take on more meatier conversations. I think these are helpful ways for us to sustain those relationships with each other so we can faithfully have an exchange of ideas and continue to love each other in the midst of that all. So that being said, I haven't been here the last 2 of these sessions, but I have watched them, watched the recordings of them. Y'all had a lovely conversation last week, and that is exciting. I'm eternally grateful for John, who helped give the order of how we were going to read the chapters. And as I was starting with chapter 7 and then going back to chapter 1, I feel like I could imagine John having a conversation with Ty saying, dude, this was a great book, but you should put 7 and 1 and 1 and 2 because that made a whole lot of sense. And I don't think that 7 buries the lead, but I do think that the order of starting with 7 and then coming back to 1 gives us a framework. It's in some ways the way I like to preach. I like to be able to set up our entry into the meat of the Bible, which is what I think John has helped us with. Starting with 7 has helped us get into a particular frame of mind as we're getting in, going back to chapter 1 and getting into the meat of the book. So y'all were able to cover a good bit of chapter 1 last week, and I'm hoping maybe we'll just kind of hit in for sure, definitely chapter 2 today, and maybe touches of chapter 3. But with that being said, what I think is comparative of both of them is these locations of where Ty was, these formative locations for Ty, both Alexandria in chapter 2, which is his formative primary education years, and then chapter 3, which is Lynchburg, his adopted hometown, which is where? What's in Lynchburg?
We didn't talk about Lynchburg, we talked about this.
Liberty
Jack Daniels
University.
Distillery.
What I meant, that's what I said.
Oh.
I thought, oh, I'm sorry, Lynchtown, sorry.
Monroe.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Monroe, excuse me. Sorry,
That's okay.
Sunday morning, I need more coffee. Yes, Monroe, right? So what I have found fascinating in my own reading through them, and what I would have you think is, and I noted some of this from your conversation last week. I'm looking around the room. Are there any, probably not online, except for Marcelo. Marcelo, you're a native Austin, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So Marcelo's native Austin. Any of the rest of you native Austin? Born and raised in Austin? So none of us really, except for Marcelo. And some of that conversation, I know Natalie mentioned a little bit last week about the idea of redlining and what the structural aspect of racism looked like in the city of Austin over the last 100+ years. And so we are going to return to that conversation later on in this course, and looking at Austin through the lens of structural racism and the impact of those decisions had not only for the time and place of the people who were living through those decisions 100 years ago, but the longevity of the impact of that, and what that still has as a generational impact on us living here and now. And I think we see echoes of that in his examination of Alexandria. But we're going to be looking at that with Austin. I have a resource. I don't know if I can get copies of this. It's called Reckoning with the Past: Slavery, Segregation, and Gentrification in Austin. And I have written several research papers about structural racism in the city of Austin. This is one of those resources that I've used, and I can provide y'all with some digitized resources as well. But I couldn't help going through his chapter 2 and his examination, his faithful examination of the history of Alexandria, without thinking about my own hometown, Amarillo, Texas, and maybe your own hometown, wherever that may be, down in the valley, Mission, Raymondville, down in the valley, or wherever that may be. And some of us come from the north, and we get that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some potential parallels of how the city itself engaged in racial either segregation or discrimination through its practices. And I think he did such a remarkable job of getting into the weeds of the details beyond the history books and into like the story of the library with Samuel Tucker and Alexandria, and how that history not only may have been forgotten, but maybe even purposefully buried, or the cemetery that had been nearly washed away and been rediscovered, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to spend some time unpacking some of that and begin looking at what I'm hoping for you as you're making your way through this journey, is that as you're reading along with him, he is at the beginning points of thinking about what I would say his location. Where is he? How is he centered? And that is not necessarily about where you are in geographically in time and place, but from what location do you approach this material? And that will include societal myths, that'll include your primitive, your primary education textbooks, the history lessons that you were taught, certainly impacted by your family story, your and the morals, the values, and the ideologies of your family that has been passed down from generation to generation, your faith. These are all elements that form your location that makes you you as you're reading this book. And he's at the beginning part of this with chapter 1, beginning to dismantle some of those things and really face the music of his formative, what has formed his location, right, wrong, and indifferent. Does that make sense? So that's the journey I hope that y'all would continue to go on as well as you're going along with him and beginning to think about what he talked about mostly with his hometown, his elementary, high school, those primitive, I keep saying primitive, those primary formative years of education. And I bet that they're wildly different amongst each and every one of us, including y'all online, that we all bring to the table, which could make such not a mosaic, but such a cacophony of noise of differences. A mosaic at least would make some sort of picture, but my guess would be if we really dug into all of our generational upbringing, our family, and our education, it would be a cacophony of noises that doesn't fully describe the realities of history, especially that which has been chosen by lawmakers or those in power and set down in script as this is the reality, this is the way it is. So let's talk a little bit first about chapter 2 and what were some takeaways, what were some aha moments that made you say, I need to underline this and put a star next to it.
Well, I never realized that Washington and the surrounding area were centers of the slave trade. That kind of shocked me that.
So that idea of what his girlfriend at the time had said, well, you're from Alexandria, that's not really the South.
That's what I thought, but
Right.
then when you read, they had the slave markets there, and what went on there, I found that to be quite shocking.
Yeah, that the slave trade was so far north. I think when I learned where the Mason-Dixon line was the first time in my life and really had an idea of geography, it surprised me how far north it was. I thought line across Tennessee, and I'm really wrong on that.
There was also significant slave trade in New York City too.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not surprised, but
Yeah, I only learned that recently.
And obviously it stopped there a lot sooner than it did at the other.
Yes, it did.
And
what else were some aha moments for you in chapter 2? Or points that you were like, wow, that one really dug home, hit home.
Josh, I don't know if it necessarily has to do with Alexandria part of it, but towards the end of this chapter was when they started talking about the textbooks, the Virginia history textbooks, and how that whole battle, grew up and raged on and still continues, actually.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm just going to piggyback with you, John, on public education. One of mine ahas that really just seared right into me was on my edition, page 67. And I wrote in 1958, he wrote in 1958, Charlottesville and Norfolk schools, as well as those in Prince Edward and Warren counties, closed by order of the governor. Thousands of school children went without education for half a decade, so Virginia could once again maintain its racial code. The General Assembly, the legislature, also created a voucher system for public funds to allow white parents to send their children to private schools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. white supremacists rarely gave up their power without a fight. And this moves on, he begins to talk about white flight. And so the idea of using the levers of the system to the voucher system to find a way, well, if we have to integrate, well, we're gonna do this voucher so we can get our white kids away from the black kids. And then we're gonna use the levers of power, and we're also gonna, as John was saying, work on rewriting textbook or writing textbooks in a way that is more favorable. He goes on into detail and description about that photograph. You remember the photograph on the cover of one of these textbooks that made, so how about we just enter into a relationship with each other? And yes, you may technically be my slave, but I shall love for you and care for you as a father loves his son. And I shall provide for all your family. You don't really need money or liberty. We will be happy. And that, and trying to purvey that image, that softness of the realities of slavery. But the idea of the voucher system in the private schools, that's the one that really seared me, especially as we're concluding this legislature of the state of Texas, and just how hot that conversation is in the legislature in 2023 in the state of Texas.
But also rewriting the textbooks.
Oh, gosh,
The
yes.
social studies textbook that talked about the people coming over from Africa as immigrants to work, we can't say the word slave, we can't talk about the bad things because that just didn't happen.
Correct. So again, also
Same
using
thing.
those levers of power to own the past. And to provide for us opportunities to escape from the realities of having to have mixed races or live within mixed regions, etc.
What's kind of scary, really scary, is that you're talking about the vouchers. Okay, that's going on. That's not only in Texas, right? That's all over. And you held the book up just a moment ago. And the first thing that, the one about Austin.
Oh, yeah.
When you held that book up like that, I thought the first thing that came to my mind is, I wonder if that was been removed.
What's that?
That book has been removed at the library, because, the folks, where was it, just outside of Austin here, what town is that?
Yeah.
I think that book's only been out for like 2 years. So I don't think they've had time to ban it. I don't think anyone's read it.
Librarian, they asked the librarian to take those books out of Lano, and she said, I can't do that. That's not right. It goes against anything I've ever known in my life. Well, she lost her job, right?
And they shut the
And
library.
they shut the library down. So you're talking about shutting this Virginia shit, well, hey, guess what? It's happening today.
Well, that's a
That's so
story.
scary.
I mean, that's a story I'm not familiar with. So that's appreciate it. And I've heard the library debates, right? Leander itself is having big library debates about what books and can be on the shelves. And I've only understood that debate through the lens of gender and sexuality, but I hadn't heard it through the lens of history or
History.
True, right now, the current discussion is on gender and sexuality, but it started in the 50s with race.
And it's still.
And there's still some of that,
It's still the race because these ultra.
The Moms for, I'm gonna just say Moms for Liberty group.
They refer to anything that talks about slavery being bad as filth that needs to be removed so that their children don't see it.
So it's not just gender and sexuality, there's also a removal of
You can't.
books by people of color.
Yeah.
Not just-
Books are being banned.
Yeah, it's not just blacks, but blacks, Hispanics, Asians.
That's kind of scary.
It's very scary
So-
because
so-
how do your children who are in a mixed environment find themselves in literature if those books aren't on the shelf? And it's very important to a beginning reader to find someone who looks like him to see that reading is important.
So let's pull out. Let's pull out for just a moment. So it's real easy, I think, and very rightly so. And we will and should have those conversations in this space. But what I feel like he is helping us do is what I'd like for us to do, which is to pull up higher a little bit and talk more about the why. I mean, at the core of it, without judgments, at the core of the why, and that the legislatures in Virginia were using these levers of power to manipulate, if you want to use that, or to rewrite or to orchestrate the society or the textbooks or the lack of textbooks or the libraries. Let's pull up to the why. And that's one of our questions, which is how and why were these myths started and who started them? And so let's see if we can't tap into that kind of that higher level of, let's try to get at the core of the why was that so important. And he really kind of honed in a lot on late 19th century, late 20th century, early 21st century of Alexandria. So if we were to kind of pull out that larger, what would be some of the core of the why?
Well, the thing that jumps out immediately to me on that is the why was when you read the last chapter with Ty. When Ty grew up, I mean, look how he grew up and what was on the front of his mind and how he was learned behavior about the South, about Robert Lee. I mean, how can you overcome that if it's learned behavior at a young age? And I mean, to me, I don't see how you overcome that. I mean, learned behavior is tough to overcome. I mean, he overcame it. This gentleman has overcome that and able to recognize it and written this book, which is just unbelievable that he's been able to do this the way to recognize that.
Josh, when you say why, are you talking about why promulgate the myth even nowadays? So
from then all the way through now. Well, let's, John, I wanted you to answer that with the nowadays, but try to go back 150 years towards the why, right? Post-Civil War, and there's the bruised ego of the South, if you want to call it that, or whatever that, 1870s, as we're trying to, in the process of Reconstruction, and how are we going to live with what we have, live with what the realities of what we've just experienced in a post-slavery United States, and we're going to go on into the future generations. What do we think was at the core of the from say 1870 to 1910? What was some at the core of what we as Southern United States folks were trying to accomplish during that time?
Stay in power. It was about control.
Yes.
John? Well, I'm not sure that it was done for the same reason back then as it is now. In that post-1910 period, like when Ty was growing up in the post-World War II. I think that part of it is done today because you don't want to be on the losing side of history twice. One, you don't want to have lost the war. But now you also don't want to sit around and say that you favor slavery and that economic, social, framework that slavery buttressed. And so you want to minimize, the horrors of slavery. You want to focus on something else. And so, that I think is why, you can today you pick your heroes, like Lee or some of the other folks, and say, oh, they were just good soldiers doing their job. That's why you don't portray slavery as it really was in textbooks or in movies. So you can not be identified with that, because I think you go around nowadays and most people would not want to be identified with favoring slavery.
No, but
so that's why they did it today. I think why they did it back then was a different reason, because they were allowed to, and there was, but they also, I don't think went through back then in that, from 1865 to 1910 and rewrote textbooks. I think that's a recent thing. I think back then, they were memorializing, folks, the soldiers and leaders and stuff on the other side, and making excuses back then as to why the North won.
Okay, John, Sue's got something.
Okay, So they may not want to be identified as saying slavery was a good thing, but a lot of those people are the ones that are saying, these Black people that, I mean, we don't want to be around them. We need to find some way to move them out of the way so that we're not having to deal with them. We don't want them in our textbooks, we don't want them in our schools, we don't want them in our neighborhoods. We would prefer them not being in our cities. We want them out of the way. So. And some of those are the same people.
Is it fear? Is it just flat out fear of the unknown? We don't take the time to get to know them, and so we don't know. So we're afraid of them.
I don't know. I'm wondering how much fear may be an unnamed factor. And I'm sorry, friends, if y'all, I don't know how well y'all can see that online. You can't see it at all. All right. Let's see. Go this way, go up, and zoom in a little bit better. You go this way. All right. Let's see. So what I wrote here, that at the 60,000 foot view, say circa 1865, 1910, what was at the core? I'm asking why. What was some at the core of the post Civil War, Southern Bruce ego trying to preserve, et cetera, et cetera. And so here were a few things that I jotted down from what y'all were saying, which was power, control, money for some of the things that are at the core, minimizing the horror of slavery. Maybe there could have been an awakening. Maybe there could have been some of this idea of, coming to terms with these dastardly things that we did, such as lynching and the whipping and the malnourishment of their bodies, et cetera, those horrors. Maybe it was a preservation of culture, the Southern way, which I think also feeds into Ty's upbringing. How do we maintain the Southern gentleman culture, the Southern idea, memorializing and excuse making? I think you do have this chapter between, say, 1870 and 1910, where we're wrestling with all this. And fear might be a variable, an underwriting variable of all this, the fear of the loss of power, the fear of the loss of control. Those Yanks are making these laws in DC there. And we see that here, right? That the national government, federal government have made these laws, and Virginia said, screw it, we're going to go our own way. Those are laws meant for the United States, not for the Old Dominion, fear of the loss of money, now the economic impact of no more slavery, and now, my wealth has got to come from different means. I got to pay these people, et cetera, et cetera. It could be fear that we have to live in relationship with persons who are not white Southern folks, et cetera. I think that could be a part of all of that. And also these two, the preservation of the culture and the memorializing, is just this period of time of coming to grips, right? It may just be just as simple as we literally have to rebuild cities. We have to rebuild communities. We got to rebuild that which has been burned, torn down, families that have been decimated, of all colors. Then we move into the Jim Crow and the more rigid aspects of segregation, et cetera, et cetera. But
Can I add one?
Who's that? Yeah, Marcelo.
So there's a writer named David Mura who wrote a book called The Stories Whiteness Tells Itself. And I'm just going to read his quote. So it's, at its core, the Lost Cause mythology was served as a victim story for white Southerners, where the horrors of slavery and the suffering of Blacks could be erased from white memory. The war became a tale in which the suffering of white Southerners obliterated Black pain in any sense of injustice of slavery. This sense of shared victimhood united 19th century Southern whites and continues into the present.
Shared victimhood. And what's that mean for you, Marcelo?
Obviously, I think we can all pretty much agree that most of the blame for this falls on the South, and in an effort to obviously absolve themselves of any blame, they're like, well, we're victims here too. You took away our way of life. We're struggling to come back from it the same way that Black people are. We're all part of slavery, and in you taking away slavery, They have to find a way to adjust in the New World. We have to find a way to adjust in the New World. And it's all because of the North. We're all the same here. We're all struggling with the same thing because of the same war, instead of we're the ones who perpetrated the violence to start. And violence is what ended up ending it.
I think even after the war, that continues, Marcella, with like we talked about last week or last class, how the South also focused on the carpetbaggers and the scalawags, right? Is part of how they continue to be victimized after the war is over. So the war obviously is a huge victimization, you know, and just there was no way they could win, all of that. But then it continued even into Reconstruction.
So you're saying, John, that there was this victimization of the white Southerners because of the carpetbaggers and the Yanks coming in and setting up shop and taking advantage and all this, that, and the other. So we were doubly victimized in that regard. And for some, you got to imagine, right? Like an alligator who gets its prey, it's really hard to pry open that grip, those jaws that have had its power clinched down on its prey for so long that to open it up would be significant to lose the meal ticket. But
Well, I think also one of the things that happened during that 1870 to 1910 period was that in southern cities, Blacks were elected to positions of power and leadership. And in some cities, the city council, they had significant numbers of Blacks. In Wilmington, North Carolina is a good example. It's quite famous. And I think that, so that's where the fear, and that's where I think the Jim Crow came from, is a backlash against, they see, oh, we're losing our power, these people. And it's because also, you think about it, there were the white male population was decimated in the South by the war. I mean, the North too, but especially in the South. So now you have the Black men who are freed are starting to outnumber in many places, or have a significant enough population that they're able to vote themselves into power, and that just terrified people.
Wonderful. Yes, and part of I think part of why I wanted to pull this out and look at it this way is how many generations in generation theory, how many generations are there between 1870 and 1910? So that would be 2 generations, about 40 years. That's about 2 generations of folks who have been experiencing and living in this fear-based, how do we rebuild, recollect ourselves, etc., after almost 200 plus years, almost 300 plus years of generation after generation after generation of this formal, this is the way of life. This is how the Southern white gentleman is. This is exactly, how I heard someone talk about it last week of, they're a product of their time period. And this is true, right? We all are in some way or another developed and formed in some way through the time period that we're living in. There's a lot of buzz about the wokeness of the time period we're living in now. And some of that may just very well be coming to grips with the realities of history and longevity it's had on us generationally. But after almost 300 years of the Southern way of life and the institution of slavery, and my pappy did it, my grandpappy did it, my great grandpappy back to the 7th generation, this is just the realities of the world. And then all of a sudden, and it is no longer the way of the world. And within these first 2 generations, let's say 40 years, we're trying to figure out how to understand who we are and who our identity is and the reality of this thing that we have been standing upon for 300 years. So go ahead.
So after the slaves became free, remember, before the Civil War, most of the millionaires in the United States were cotton farmers,
Correct.
cotton plantation owners. A lot of them were really horrible to their slaves. Now the slaves are free. They don't have to work for those people anymore. If it's not for Jim Crow. And he has no way, they have no way of getting their cotton picked into. So by enacting Jim Crow that kept those people from doing anything else, that pushed them back into, they weren't slaves,
Right.
but they weren't well treated, they weren't well paid, and they had no choice in the matter.
They become indentured.
Yes, the same sort of thing.
And that isn't a time period, right? It's a whole nother argument, but I'd be glad to say that there is some indentured servitude in the valley of South Texas today.
Yes.
Look at the citrus farms. I mean, there is
Oh, yeah.
plenty of it. But it's just another way in which we've manipulated the mechanism, the levers of power to achieve the ends that we had for 300 plus years, right? And so there's this kind of reformatting and the loss of identity, all of the stuff that we go through when we grieve, the loss of identity, bargaining, pleading, denying, acceptance, all of those things culturally, we're trying to better understand. And in many ways, what is the denial aspect, right, plays in grief, plays a massive fear of this identity, which we see lived out in a lot of what he wrote, and the denial of what it is. And in our grief of denial, we say, my father didn't die from smoking. My father died from emphysema. So, there's a way in which we've written the story, right? Because my denial doesn't want to admit that my father caused his own impending doom, correct? So let's look then at 1910, and I don't even know how far to go, but let's just say 1970. I don't know, I'm just got ballparking here. Now we've had 2 generations who've been working with this. And to be fair, I'm sure that in the midst of the Southern United States, right, those who were part of the Union, my guess is there was definitely some who made the pivot, moved into acceptance of this new reality, the new identity. We certainly had the carpetbaggers of the Yankees come down here and we're fostering this new way of life, et cetera. But we still have, in the midst of all of this, a large, if not predominant portion of those who were living in the Southern United States, in that sense, that loss of identity, who are still clinging on to the 300 years of generational hand-me-downs of way of life that still preserved the Southern white Christian gentleman and all those aspects that still exist all the way through today. And so as we've begun to figure out how to preserve that, we've in our denial or our bargaining or whatever it is that we want to call that, we begin now to institutionalize a way to preserve some of what was there and hand it down to our children and our children's children. And one of the ways we figured out how to do that is through the textbooks, through ways in which we limit access to historical documents, through the library, storytelling.
Separation of education.
Say that again.
Separation of education.
Of education.
Don't give them the same education my baby's gonna get.
Confederate monuments.
Confederate monuments, but also what? The renaming of streets, memorializing within the Confederate leaders in the memorializing of streets, memorializing them in the renaming of military bases after Confederate leaders, public education schools. I mean, did it not sear your heart also when you read that all of the Black students at Alexandria went to what named elementary school? Robert E. Lee. That's not a coincidence. Correct?
Yeah.
Right? That's not a coincidence. These are the ways in which we've been trying to figure it out in these 40 years, this generational aspect. We've been trying to figure out, you know what, we may not be able to do this slavery thing, but we can still preserve a certain ideology and a way of life. And we're going to do damn well whatever we can. And we're going to continue to raise children, our children, and pass these things down ad infinitum. And I would be I would have no problem myself arguing that we, to this day, with our elected officials, see elements of this still, both in our state houses and in our nation's capital. That we see elements of this, and in part because hand me down, hand me down, hand me down, hand me down. So the reverse side of all of this is all talking about, I think most all of this I'm laying out here is almost all white focused.
You know, it was over 100 years from the end of the Civil War until African Americans were allowed to go to most of the universities in the South.
Right.
You know, it's 100 years, so it was over, and everything was supposed to be the same, but it was 100 years. So
Yes. So that's the segue. That's the segue to what I want to say next, or what I would bring up next, which is just think for a moment about 400 plus years of a system that advantages one race over another through the mechanisms of power that are institutionalized in our laws and our civic organizations, our educational structures, et cetera. And then even through the change of it all in a post-Civil War, anti-slavery United States, we're still finding ways through the powers and all of those levers of mechanisms to achieve what we have had for 300 plus years, and continuing to advantage our generational families and disadvantage certain other families. So it wasn't until, what'd you say, 1975, early 90s, somewhere 70s, excuse me, right, where many of the, I mean, shoot, Tiger Woods couldn't play at Augusta until 25 years ago. Until the early 90s. And so there were still all these ways in which the remnants of what we had lived into for 400 years were still being eradicated, still being dismantled. I think Tiger Woods in Augusta, for those of you who golf, is an example of an institution that had institutionalized racism that we began to see a dismantling of a system, of a way of life that was kind of a prestigious institution that held on to a certain ideology until such a moment arose that enabled them to make that change, to dismantle a rule book.
Well,
But they didn't want to though.
I'm not saying they did,
But I mean,
but they did.
they had
Correct.
to.
Right?
Yeah.
And we still see some of those structures. There's still a lot of we don't want to, but we do. That happens today. I mean, and whether it's black, white, male, female, gay, straight, those structures are all still prominent and existent today. But in the midst of it all, you had a particular set of persons, predominantly white persons, who continued to benefit from a 400-year identity, and a particular set of persons, mostly in the Black community and brown community, who continue to be disenfranchised or disallowed to benefit from the institutions because of the way in which we wrote them. And at the same time, we've continued to grow children under a certain historical ideology that have now grown to become elected leaders of our societies, who are now in those institutions of power, whether you call them moms of liberty, whether you call them blah, 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 whatever it may be. There are all these structures that are still in place for us that I would argue, and I think it's a reasonable argument, that still have these tentacles of generational inheritance.
And they would tell you that too.
yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
So,
they're not hiding anything really.
No, that's right.
no, because I went to college in the South, and I mentioned, I think, earlier on in our thing, so I can tell you that I looked at things you've outlined here. One thing that's also very, very obvious in the South is the mindset of superiority. There's no question that Black people in the late 60s and early 70s were superior individuals to Blacks. in the South. Not going to universities, not going to any country club, certainly not playing at a golf course. Oh my gosh, you kidding? So the whole concept of everything, a lot of it roots back to the mindset that we are superior. We are superior. We make the rules. We got the money, we got the land, and we've got the businesses. We've got the money, we've got the power. And so you're not one of us. That's the way I felt.
Right.
When I would do a job, let's say, and I'd work in the summer up there in state, and this is around Chattanooga. And I'd work with people that were Black, and we'd work together, and I never really felt like that. Even in South Texas with Hispanics, you work with them. It wasn't the same mindset of a Black person, because you talk about doing something and you don't talk. I mean, they just kind of, because I don't do that. I can't do that. Whereas in South Texas, Hispanic pretty much does a lot of stuff. But I did see a discrepancy in the mindset. And that's where I come back to learned behavior, and I come back to superiority. It's bred
Right.
in the families,
Yeah.
all the way down.
And I think the question that I have you hone back in on, Bill, and all of us is, what gives me that mindset? What is it that leads me to inherently believe that I'm better than you?
All the rhetoric of Robert E. Lee, all the rhetoric of the South, the plantation owners, the glory life.
My parents told me, my grandparents told them, my great grandparents told them.
Yeah.
Everybody knows it. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
a fact.
I think one of the author's points repeatedly in the book is that it's a combination, it's a pincher movement, right? So on the one hand, it's what you're hearing from the people that are most important in your formative years, your parents, in your family, stuff like that. But then if you then go into the educational system or the workplace or whatever, and you get it there as well, in other words, it reinforces what you were told growing up, then why would you doubt that? And so the author, at numerous points in the parts of the book we've read so far, says, I never knew. If I had only had access to the facts, whether through a textbook, movies, fiction, literature, if I'd only seen the other side, I probably wouldn't have wanted to grow up and be, that Southern ideal gentleman.
Or pedestalize Robert E. Lee as much as he did, and me too, right? I mean, my mom shared last week, Katie shared last week that she went to a high school, Johnny Rebel, the Confederate flag, when I went to the same high school and had all the same sort of feels in the 90s, right? So there, that idea of this particular Southern way of life that goes unchallenged, unquestioned, and to do anything otherwise would be counterintuitive. It just wouldn't make sense.
I mean, because the author even grew up in he played sports his high school year, in his high school years, but they all played against white teams, but there was another division of Black schools.
Yeah.
So there was basically two state champions, one white, one Black. And if the white and the Black had ever met, okay, I'm sorry, the white team would have been demolished.
Yeah. I think
I mean, I actually, somewhere in reading chapter 3, I pulled up, I don't know how many of y'all remember Jimmy the Greek, the sportscaster from the 70s and 80s. Okay, he got fired because he said the Blacks were bred. Okay, I'm sorry, 300 years of breeding slaves to get them to be able to pick cotton more swiftly. He had a point.
He said their bodies didn't float. And it's something to do with saying that they couldn't swim because of how their bodies were bred.
Actually, they were faster because their thighs were built bigger. I actually looked at photo. It was. I'm like, but at the time it happened, a part of me is like, there's truth in his statement.
so.
And so you look at that, and how can you?
I think if I'm going to ask that question, Joan, I think that if I'm going to examine Jimmy the Greek or those statements or consider those things, I think I'm going to tread very carefully on
Yes.
that. In part because part of the social sciences in the late 1800s was also the examination of how what's the word, eugenics. Thank you. I would be, I think, you know, I don't know all of that. I think the reason why I would tread very carefully is it might be a slippery path towards the eugenics ideology
Okay.
or study. And when I think very, you know, I think people, cultural people from all around the world, more Darwinian, where generationally humans evolved to the environments in which they live. When I traveled to Southwest and I stopped in an Indian reservation, Native American reservation in Southwest Arizona, I have no idea how anybody lives in Southwest Arizona.
Especially last week.
You know, and yet these Native Americans have been there for 10,000s of years, and I wonder about how God has manifested their bodies in such a way to adapt to those environments that this boy couldn't. I can barely walk to the car. So I think I'd be cautious about that, because I think there might be some of this idea about the habitats in which we're raised has some impact on their, regardless of race, but more about how culturally we're shaped and formed.
Yes.
And
What
how
our
we-
culture values cultivates.
Again,
our
regardless
families
of,
and our-
I think
yeah.
regardless of race in that regard, but but I think about, and I want to make one other point, and then we'll, and it's really kind of under this last question. How are they promulgated? This is your word, promulgated, your word, Seaman, and continued today. And this is where I give an ear to the Supreme Court decisions of June 2023. And I would rather invite us into a one side or another. I just would, I think, invite us to adapt a research mindset. I think it'd be very important for us to read the decisions, the writings of the Supreme Court related to affirmative action. I think it'd be very important for us to go back, was it the 90s when affirmative action went into place?
So, Gaki goes back to the 80s or 70s, 70s or 80s. Yeah.
It might be good to go back and read some of the decisions during that time, not to sway your mind one way or another, but at the 60,000-foot view, looking at maybe some themes. When we have a Supreme Court, change and reverse its statement on affirmative action, it can elicit a lightning rod. Well, that really pissed me off, or I'm really in favor of this. And I think it is a disservice to ourselves and to our faith as Christians to just take it lock stock. I'm not saying that I'm going to go back, I want to go read them, but if they're going to make an argument to overturn it, then I want to read the argument and have that conversation with them, just like I do when I'm reading the Bible. There are things in the Bible that may not sit well with me, but my invitation is to have the conversation with the Bible via the Holy Spirit, with God, about how this is instructive on my faith and what this may mean. And can I get some perspective? Are there tenets in the statements they're making that might have some grounding in this generational impact from post-Civil War and all that we've been through since then? Definitely, I think there might be some verbiage there and some of what's written, and the ethics, the morals, the values that are inherent in those decisions that may give us some insight into those decisions. I think then what we do is we then turn to Scripture and ask ourselves to juxtapose these two statements that are inherently juxtaposed to themselves, to gather all that up, and the insight that may give us and juxtapose it to scripture and ask the question, not only how are these promulgated and continue today, but how does the justice of God have influence on our own understandings of how we feel about these matters? That is not easy work. What is easy work? Easy work is to see, oh, well, they overturn affirmative action. That pisses me off. I'm against it. Or, heck yeah, I'm for it. That's easy work. The hard work is the digging in and striving to be fair, to hear, to listen to that opposing view, reaching to understand, maybe trying to juxtapose it with historical information and how things have happened generationally. I don't think there's a whole lot written about this, right? From 1870 and 1910, there's nothing much written between 1870 and 1910 about the emotional state of the United States during that time. There's probably not a whole lot written about the United States emotional state between 2000 and 2023, but there may very well be in 2070. Because how much have we lived through? And just if you were to mark a point in time, just from the birth of the iPhone to present day, is not even yet one full generation, or it's right about one full generation. And think about everything that's happened in our lives since 20 years ago. All the things that our world has experienced, and the stretching, the prodding, the pulling, the examination, and the reaction, and the in some ways the massive divisiveness, and our rigidity, and how we push and pull and battle each other just in the last 20 years, and what impact that's going to have on our generation and the next generation for the next 50 years. The final thing I mentioned to you, and this is extra credit homework, if you are ever interested. One of my all-time favorite books was written by Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and it's No Future Without Forgiveness. Marcelo, Marcelo crunches like 10 books a month, and avid reader. And this would be one of the books I would give you. And it is this beautifully written, terribly gut-wrenching, hard book to read about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa, and his role and in how the nation addressed the horrors and the realities of racism in its country. And one of the biggest misses I think the United States has is it has never, ever had a moment to proclaim the truth and the realities of the world in which we've had for 200 and years, or 400 years, pre-1776, where we had a moment publicly to face all of the horrors and the truths of the society that we have built as a gateway for building something beautiful on the other side, and giving birth to a brand new nation on the other side. There still exists a ton of generational racism that exists all throughout South Africa. But if you want to study the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what it achieved, how it was structured, and if you were to think about it through the lens of, gosh, wouldn't it have been great if we had had that?
It's called the Book of Forgiving.
No Future Without Forgiveness. Imagine if our society had had that, whether in 1870s, the 1970s, or right now. Imagine the impact it could have had and could have. I don't think it would ever come to be. I don't think that the United States would suffer a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because it's too polarizing. There's too much of this now, 150 years of embedded denialism, right, and whitewashing and myth institutionalizing, that it might be too difficult for us to overcome. In the way in which they did it in South Africa. They did it fresh, right on the heels of the end of apartheid. So those are some of the things I would encourage you to be thinking about as we're digging in and get even further into the meat of the book. Yes, Diana.
What is the name of the little book that you were talking about?
I will see if I can't find a digital copy of this. It's called Reckoning with the Past: Slavery, Segregation, and Gentrification in Austin. And we've built in some time for us to talk about this towards the end of the class. So at the beginning of August, we've taken some time. We're going to take some time pictures and apply some of what we've been experiencing and learning into our current context. You know, Marcelo notwithstanding, all the rest of us are non-natives, but we all live here now. So let's take some time to take a look at applying so much of this and how it is formative to where we are in our time and place at 11512 Olson Drive, Austin, Texas. Some of that may be dislocating, maybe unsettling, but also I think very informative for us in our time and place. Cool. Any final thoughts, anybody?
That book is available at the Austin Library. There's 5 copies available.
What she said.
But the other one isn't. No future without forgiveness is not there.
Really?
I already put it on hold. Sorry.
What'd you say? You already put it on hold at the
I
Austin
have
Library?
both of them on hold. The Austin one has 2 that are in library only, though. I think there are 3 copies.
Yeah, well,
Oh, so you have to sit in the library to read
I
it?
did not find it.
Oy.
Marcelo, you have to sit in the library to read it. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
you can't take it out of the library. It's library use only, so you have to just stay there and read it. I don't know why.
Yeah, well, don't worry about it. Marcelo will finish it in the afternoon. And
Oops, never mind, I found it. No.
any final thoughts before we move towards prayer today? Anybody online? I'm sorry, I've been a little bit of a jabberwox. Okay. Well, let's do our closing prayer together, shall we? Oh, Holy One, friend of the enslaved and oppressed, you did not enter our world in an ethereal, beautiful body to excrete a few tidbits of wisdom. You were incarnated as an in-flesh, exhausted, and eventually executed human being. Teach us to take the side of the oppressed as you did. Point us to the example of Moses, of your prophets of Christ, who with boldness and truth proclaimed that the lives of the exploited matter. Amen. God be with you all, and good to see you. Thank you, Hal and Joan. I hope to meet y'all some other time next time you're in town, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Sean.
Arrivederci.
I'll finish those books fast